So everybody, welcome to the Nature Journal Club. If this is your first time, or if you're an educator who's with us, this is actually a very good first introductory workshop, because what we're going to be doing is taking a look at two things. One is, on a very kind of big picture, what is this nature journaling business all about? Why are we doing what we're doing? If you've been journaling for a while, it's actually really useful to think about this, because the more sort of on a meta level you're thinking about, why am I doing what I'm doing? It helps you really be articulate about, oh, I'm doing this now, and here's my reason, my motivation for doing that. It helps you be able to be a little bit more intentional about what you're doing with your nature journal. But if you are in a position where you also want to teach this to somebody, be that your grandchild, or a family you're working with in a homeschool environment, or if you're a classroom teacher or an outdoor educator, I believe that keeping a nature journal is not only the most important tool for a naturalist, for an observer, for keeping a journal like this, the most important tool for really paying attention to your life, but it is, I think, the most underused educational tool. And we're going to take a look at sort of what it is, why it works, why it's so effective, and then how to do it. All right? But what I want to do to kind of just start is just to sort of play with our human perception a little bit, and to think about how we think about things, how we see, and how we go about solving problems. Because we have the illusion that I'm really good at problem solving, right? Most people think they're above average. Right?
By definition.
But statistically that can't work, right? And we also get the impression that I'm really good at observing the world around me. And if something's happening, I'm going to notice it. But our brains, it turns out, are completely overwhelmed by the data stream that's coming in through our senses. And it's screening tons of stuff out before it even gets to your attention. And on top of that, if you give your brain just a few little mental tasks, the bandwidth of your head quickly gets filled up. It goes, I can't take anymore, right? And we really can't handle a lot of complex ideas at the same time. Fortunately, there's something we can do about it, and you know where I'm going with this. It happens to be nature journaling, but I'm going to make a case why. But let's just take a look at this is your brain on observation. So I'm going to make the argument that the bandwidth of your brain is actually pretty narrow. Let's take a look at that. So here is a pattern. What I want you to do is just to stare right there in the center. Stare in the center, and you'll notice blink, 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 and then it rotates, and then blink, 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 right? So here's the weird thing. Your brain, as wonderful as it is, cannot handle blink, 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 and rotation at the same time. Right? So as you look here, you'll notice that it appears that the lights are blinking. The minute it starts to rotate like that, even though the lights are still blinking, they will appear to lock in place. Let's just look at that again. Your brain can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time. So here it is blinking, and just stare at the center, and you'll notice when it starts to rotate, they just seem to lock up.
Oh, that is fascinating.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah.
Right? And this time, what I want you to do is just follow one of the dots as it starts to rotate, and you'll notice that it continues to change its color the whole time. Isn't that weird? So just a simple thing, our brain can't handle it. Right? So what does your brain do about this bandwidth problem? Well, part of what it does is to kind of make its job easier. If you expect something to happen, right, your brain was probably going to take the easy shortcut, and that's actually what you're going to see. Not just sort of on an idea level, but on the very level sometimes of our perception. We see what we expect to see. So here's a little random pattern of dots, and you'll notice that it's going to move up and down. Ready? Up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. Right? Did you see the dots move? Right? What if I told you that only for the first two screens they went up and down, and after that it was a pattern of random dots? The motion that you saw was because I was saying up, down. So just to prove that to you, we're going to try that again. This time, you're going to be the Jedi Master. And you're going to hold your hand out like this, and as you look at it, you're going to move your fingers up, down, up, down, up, down. And at a random point, what I want you to do is start going right, left, right, left, right, left. Ready? Here we go. And use the force. The force is strong with this one. Right? Try making it go diagonal. Right? You're good. You got it. You got it. There is no try. There's only do or do not. And then we're going to take a look at one more little thing with this. Also, part of what your brain is doing when you're even just perceiving on a raw level, your brain is taking all of the information in front of you. You have the perception that you're seeing in hyper detail everything that's in front of you. Actually, you only are seeing detail in one little spot in the middle of your face, and your brain is filling in all the blanks around the side. They're blurry, and it doesn't even regularly refresh your screen. It keeps a lot of stuff that you had seen kind of present in your awareness as a fill-in for having to waste neural energy in kind of perceiving that. And normally we don't have any way of seeing this, but I would like to show you the ghouls. They're going to help you be able to see this. Now, here are some Hollywood celebrities. Now, if you subscribe to People magazine, something like that, you'll be able to recognize too many of these faces. But you'll just notice these are the faces of Hollywood celebrities that you see in tabloids, right? There's nothing, we've not doctored the faces other than the Photoshops that have, before their press agents kind of Photoshop their faces, and perhaps some plastic surgery here and there. But I haven't gone in and doctored these. You saw those faces, right? This time what I want you to do is, instead of looking at the faces, I want you to concentrate your eyes right here on this cross right in the middle of the screen. And you're only going to observe these faces out of your peripheral vision, out of the corner of your eye. Right? So, and again, I haven't gone here and modified these faces. What you're going to be doing is your brain is going to be using some new data, but you're going to find out that very quickly it's going to start to splice in old information. This is what your brain does all the time, but you never have a way of seeing it. Let's see what happens. If you think I'm making some twisted pictures, just glance your eyes back on the sides and you'll see their normal faces when you look at them. Isn't that bizarre? Ew. Right. The reptilians are here. Right? So this is what's going on in your brain all the time. Your brain is just barely getting by. If you give yourself the task of having just to memorize the sequence of 7 or so numbers, and you try to do another task at the same time, you're not going to do a very good job at that. Performance goes way down. Just trying to hold a sequence of numbers in a person's head, as they walk down a hallway, you can experimentally tell somebody, I want you to go just down into the next room, and on the way, they meet somebody who needs help. Right? If they're trying to remember those numbers, they're less likely to help that person. Right? Our brain gets full, and the way we behave, the way we think changes, because our brain is just going, I'm trying to hold on to some numbers. Right? So it's a bandwidth problem. It's like on my little laptop, when I've got too many things open, the whole thing just crawls, and I have to close a bunch of programs, right? Or I could upgrade, but that's not going to happen for a long time. So I just close more programs. What if we could do this with our brain? Well, it turns out you can. And the way to do it is to externalize your thinking, to get stuff out of here and into here. As you download information from your brain, your observations, your thinking, the connections you're making, all that stuff, as you download that onto a piece of paper, you actually free up space in your brain to do more complex thinking, to observe new things, to notice things that you otherwise wouldn't have noticed. If you're just sort of staring at something, right, your brain gets full. And then what happens is you just sort of start recycling, noticing the same thing. It's just called rumination. And you're actually not aware that you're doing that. You feel like you're actively observing, but your brain is just in this little loop, right? So if you start to download it to a piece of paper, right, then your brain goes, oh, I've already noticed that. Now let's see what else I can get. See what else I can get. And this is true for your direct observations, the questions that you're asking, the connections that you're making, all that stuff. It goes from here onto there. Your brain starts working better. We think to ourselves of people like Da Vinci. Isn't it wonderful that Da Vinci, who was this super smart person, kept notebooks that we can look at now so we can see what was in Da Vinci's brain? Right? I would argue that the reason Da Vinci's brain was Da Vinci's brain was because Da Vinci downloaded that information to the notebooks, did this all the time, and that frees up more bandwidth for thinking about other things. Think about yourself, you're preparing for a trip, right? You're preparing for a trip, you've got all these things in your head, all this stuff. If you forget that, you're going to have really cold fingers, right? No gloves. Oh no, I gotta bring gloves, gotta bring gloves, gotta bring gloves. You go into bed, I gotta bring gloves, gotta bring gloves, gotta bring gloves. Right? You can't sleep well because you gotta bring gloves. What do? Write it down. You make a list. You externalize your thinking. You get it from here to there. Oh, it feels so much better. And does that work? Works really well. Works really well. Check out the book, Getting Things Done. Right? It has a bunch of strategies like this for kind of just making yourself more productive. But one of the big things in that is list making. Right? You get it out of here and onto there, you're going to be able to do more stuff. Right? So what I'm going to suggest we do is, as stuff is coming in, as we're experiencing things in nature, or any time, any place we want to experience the world a little bit more richly and deeply, what we do, get it out of here and onto there, I'm going to suggest using 3 languages. 3 languages. These are writing, drawing pictures, visual language, and also quantifying things. The dual coding theory of learning suggests that the part of your brain that is involved in looking at pictures is different than the part of your brain that is involved in using written language. It's not that one is better than the other, it's that they're just fundamentally different. So if you're using both of those, you have more neural resources or at your disposal to deal with whatever you're doing. They just are going to make your brain approach something, think about something in a different way. In this case, just by the nature of doing something a little bit differently, it's going to help you. Quantification is the same way. In some cases, people go, oh, I hate math, I don't like math. Or math sort of takes me out of the beauty of connecting with the world. Math is just another language for exploring patterns and describing things. And the more that we can make ourselves comfortable with it, we can start to do incredible things. Right? So people who get really comfortable with this sort of symbolic language of math, they can sit there and they say, you can look at something like E equals mc squared, and they go, wow, that really means something to them. Isn't that weird? So for the rest of us, we look at E equals mc squared and it means blah, 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 blah. Or somebody then is really nice and they explain it to us and they say, you see, that means energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Which to the rest of us means blah, 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 blah. Like what does it really mean to multiply mass times the speed of light? And how can you, and you're squaring that speed of light. So speed of light, that's we're talking about something moving faster, and you can like turn that into a number, and then you're squaring that thing moving faster, and you're multiplying that by, like, I can multiply a number by a number, but what are you really talking about? Other people, so for me it's like, still don't get it, right? But other people who are comfortable with this language, they're like, oh no, I can actually use that, and I can then use that to make predictions. That's crazy, right? So, but the more that I actually kind of get myself to explore that as another language, in addition to writing, in addition to drawing, I'm going to have more different ways that my brain can approach something, more of a trampoline for my curiosity to play on. Right? So, let's unpack this a little bit. Right? So for writing, if you are writing a paragraph, your brain is going to work one way. If you're making little bullet points of ideas, your brain is going to work another. Right? So again, just with this idea of it's going to be different and different is good, that's where we want to go. Right? So in my notebooks, I'm going to sometimes write things in paragraphs. I'm sometimes going to make little bullet points. Other times, I'm going to just add little labels on things. All of these are just different ways of using language. Let's explore this idea of quantification. I'm not saying that we're going to jump to understanding the E equals mc squared in the symbolic language of math, but how can we start to begin to incorporate quantification into my thinking and into my exploration and the way that I go about trying to figure things out? Oh, actually, let's not do that yet. Let's do that after this next slide. So another thing is that once you get stuff on the page, there's a really interesting thing that you can do. Because all of a sudden, you've got stuff on the page, instead of it being here, you can actually look at what you've been thinking about. You can look at what you have been observing and noticing. And so at a higher level, you're not just down here observing, but you're going to start to observe, oh, what have I been observing so far? How have I been going about doing that? And what this is called is metacognition. So I'm thinking about the way that I'm observing. I'm thinking about the way that I'm thinking. And it turns out that if we get students and adults to actually, every once in a while, kind of fly up to a higher level and kind of analyze the way that I'm thinking and looking at this, I can start to identify patterns and things that I otherwise would not be able to see. And that's a real strength of getting it on paper. I can actually start to look at from a higher elevation, get up in my little rocket ship and look down at, oh, right, I'm starting to see a pattern with these things, and let's describe that, right? So I can fly up at a higher level and start to notice relationships between things because it's physically on the page there. Another way of kind of going meta, that higher level, is that if I were to put a title on this page where I'm talking about what are the big ideas that I'm encountering here? What are my big ideas? If I were to kind of think, what is my big message here? What's my big take home? And some people, you get to, even if you're doing in your journal, when was the last time you got to use bubble letters? Right? You're gonna have a lot of fun making big titles. And some people who they're into their calligraphy, they can do the calligraphy. And so sometimes people will look at those elements on a page and say, this is just making a page fancy, right? No reason to do that. But what if it's another way of just getting yourself to float up at a higher level and say, what is the big picture of what I'm thinking about here, right? So the title, not just what is today's date or what is this bird, but is there some kind of big idea that I'm getting here? Make that sort of a big title, and in your brain, that idea goes up as to a higher level of hierarchy. You're saying that here's sort of some sub-ideas, here's the big picture idea. You're beginning to think about your own observations in that way. So putting a title in with your observations, or putting in a box around something you're thinking, like, this is a really interesting idea. This is something really significant. I want this is special. I'm going to have that stand out. Or sometimes I'll put a little exclamation point next to something that I think is really cool. I'll put that in on my page. Right? Then there is also quantification. Right? The easiest way to start to quantify is just to count things. So there's all these books out there, countless books, that will say, the sky was filled with countless birds. Scientifically, this is pretty useless. Right? So why not, I don't know, I count them! Right? Or if you can't count them, estimate them. Right? And at the start, when we try to do this, we're not going to be really good at estimating. But the more we practice it, the better and better and better we're going to get at estimating. Right? So if I can't count, I'm going to estimate. So I'm beginning to find the numbers in what I'm looking at. Another way of finding the language of math and what I look at is to start to measure things. Right? I carry a little ruler in my journal, so for millimeters. I really do prefer the metric system for measuring things. The kind of inches, the units in the sort of the standard system, it just gets really clunky really, really fast. Like we've got things that are in eighths, that are then in units that are in 12s, that are then in units that are in 3s. And then what is the unit on the other side of that? Right? So actually the metric system ends up being a little bit more useful to start to measure things. So I want to get myself to begin to be comfortable with that. Another thing I can do is I can start to time things. I'm out there, I watch the greed dives, I start saying 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4. It comes back up. I know how long that greed dove. So I can, if I'm making an observation and I just superimpose time over that, or I'm watching a slug move. The slug seems to be moving really fast. I put a little leaf next to it and start timing, right? And after 1 minute, I can measure how far my slug went, right? I get the slug rate, right? That's pretty cool. Another thing that my personal favorite way of bringing quantification into my journals is what's called a stem leaf plot. And this is it's an extremely useful way of finding, when you get a bunch of numbers, if you get data, like if you were to measure how long that bird dove in a whole bunch of different dives, and how many seconds it was 47 seconds the next time, 4 seconds the next time was 70 seconds. You'll get these numbers. If you put those in a list, your brain won't make sense of that. Probably one of the biggest gaps in Western education is an understanding of probability and statistics. It's missing from most of our education. And it's something that is hard for us to initially kind of grok and wrap our heads around. This is the reason that people buy lottery tickets. Right? Lottery tickets are a tax on people who haven't taken statistics. Right? Learning this little technique, I'm not going to go into it right now. But I'll do a blog post on it if I haven't done that already. This is something really fun to learn. Also, if you have my book on nature drawing and journaling, this was so important to me that I spent 2 pages in that book. Right? And so for our friends at home, you're thinking, wait, I have that book, and they haven't seen these 2 pages on how to build a stem leaf plot. You're right. It's really weird. It's in the book, but nobody has seen it. It's the 2 pages that nobody, I'm finding, has read. Because everybody wants to flip to the part where you say, like, here's how to put highlights on the tail of a salamander, right? But this is really, really, really useful. So see if you can find it. You're like, that was there all along? Yeah, and it's that important. It's pretty cool. So the stem leaf plot, it allows you to not just collect data, but your drawings of that data end up turning into a little histogram of the distribution, the central tendency, and the spread of that data. So you don't need to calculate a mean and a standard deviation. Your numbers turn themselves into a picture automatically. So for you educators out there, this is a great way to start to bring in statistics and probability into your classroom. Love me some stem leaf plots. Ooh, I do. Ooh. Right? So we've got quantification, we've got writing. We also have developing visual note-taking, visual thinking. And so what I'm going to do is, if I'm really interested in this flower, I want to have a toolkit of other skills that I can use to sort of develop that. So the idea of like, oh, I'm really interested in that part there, I can do an enlargement of that. Once you realize that, you start making enlargements of things you're interested in everywhere. You're even doing a little landscape drawing. You go like, wow, and then there's that little point way out there, the little lighthouse. I'm going to do a little enlargement over here of that. You know, you're able to sort of bring this idea into the vocabulary of your visual note-taking all over the place. A couple other examples of kind of more visual note-taking tricks and tools. This little flower has a cool ovary here, and from the side view here, I can't really say very much about that, but if I slice it in half, I can make a little cross-section of that, right? And just going like, oh, that's another way of just deepening the amount and the richness of the visual information that I can convey. The book on nature journaling has lots of ideas like these for expanding your toolkit of visual note-taking. Right? So you see something, how many different ways can you turn that around in your head? And all of a sudden you're not just looking at this like an artist, you begin to look at it as a botanist or as an architect or an engineer. All these different mindsets change the way your brain approaches what you're looking at. And that gives you, again, a bigger trampoline for your curiosity to play on. This, then, is your toolkit, right? And you want to add in more, anytime you see a quantification tool, you want to add that to your toolkit. When you see somebody doing interesting things with words, like oh my gosh, I didn't know I could do that. Oh, yes I can, right? You're going to look through other people's journals and try to find ways with visual notes, written notes, or quantification to enrich the tools that you bring to bear. Otherwise, what we all end up doing is something that just kind of looks like the country diary of an Edwardian lady, right? Mm-hmm. Where here's a profile picture of the flower next to a block of text about it, mm-hmm. right? But there's so much more dynamic stuff that we can do that makes us think in more nuanced and interesting ways. Nice. So there's our toolkit. So what are we going to do with this toolkit? On the page of our journal, that's where my whole naturalist exploration adventure kind of comes into life. Whenever I go out as a naturalist, I use a 3-part prompt to help me think in a more nuanced and interesting way about what I'm seeing. Right? So the outdoor educators in the back of the room, do you guys know what they are? The 3?
I observe, I wonder, and it reminds me of.
Ooh!
Yes, that's my favorite.
Right, she says, I observe, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. Right? So my friends and I, we call this in a warm-up. Right? So that's I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. Right? This is my nature study mantra. Right? And it starts with I notice. And you train yourself just kind of get in on something and you start this stream of consciousness riff of I notice, I notice, I notice, I notice, I notice, not filtering. So if I don't even have a journal, I just start doing this out loud, not in my head. Because verbalizing things is another way of externalizing your thinking. Right? So I'll often verbalize things until I can start long enough to get them down onto paper. And so if you see it, say it. Right? And then what happens is questions begin to come up, right? Out of this sea of observations that you're making. You'll get this, here's how questions will present themselves to you. Questions don't come by like, oh my goodness, I wonder what, no. The questions will present themselves to you subtly. Like, oh, that's funny. That's odd. So when you get the feeling of, that's funny, so Isaac Asimov said that most great discoveries in science are not heralded with eureka, but with that's funny. Right? When you get that, that is a sign that there is something in your perceptual environment, something that you're seeing, that is different than the way you think things are supposed to be. This might be a good place to lean in. Right? There's something that I'm seeing that is different than the way that my model of the universe is. And when I get that, what I do is, I go like, okay, what's the question there? What is the question? And to help me kind of get a richer kind of questioning system, I use that kind of classic reporter journalism series of prompts. So the who questions, what animal is this? What animal made that track? What bird made that hole in the tree? Whose nest is this? What kind of bird is singing that song? What kind of snake did I find right over there? Whose shed skin is this? So that's a who question. What questions are very similar to that, but they're about things that don't have personalities. Right? So about, weather phenomenon or patterns you're seeing in the ice. You want to look for some sort of weird patterns. You see some sort of strange thing. Anything that makes you kind of go, right? Like, ooh, right, let's record this and start asking about it. The where and when get to location and time. So that can be, when the migratory birds come back down to the San Francisco Bay Area, what areas do they go to? When do they start migrating back north? Right? So anything with timing, that's a when question. Where could be where on the rock do you find these kinds of lichen? Right? Are they always on the shady side? Right? And then you find yourself with this question, you're running around the meadow, looking at all sorts of rocks. How things are really fun. Those are also really fun for phenomena and things. Like what is driving behind that? We've almost lost the culture of the tinkerer, right? The tinkerer is the person who has the sort of an insatiable curiosity in their head, and they have the idea that, by messing around with stuff, I might be able to figure out something about it. Like old school naturalists and inventors, a big part of their productivity is because they had this raw expectation that by mucking about with stuff, you could figure things out. Right? Now we have the idea that you figure things out by looking in the books at what stuff that other people have figured by mucking about with stuff. Or do a Google search. But it's that mucking about that got all that stuff into the book in the first place. So what if part of our natural inclination is to go there right off the bat? The why questions are also really interesting. They're the hardest ones to try to answer because you can never directly observe the answer to a why question. You can observe when the birds leave the pond, why they left there. You can speculate about, and you can have evidence to back up those speculations, but you can't really get inside the head of that bird. And even if you could, would you still be able to do it? Sometimes figuring out our own motivations. Why did I really do that? I might have some sort of proximal idea of what sort of motivated me to do that, but there might be some sort of more ultimate motivation inside of me that through years of therapy I might be able to uncover. Who knows? All right? So why questions, they're worth asking, and they're important, but they're more difficult. So I'll show you kind of what you can do with a why question in a moment. So this is this is what I do with those questions. So I notice, I wonder. Now it reminds me of is where I'm going to intentionally go out, and if I've seen anything like this before, if I have read anything about this before, or this just reminds me of something, it can be poetic or scientific. I was out with a group of Charlotte Mason educators, and we were doing this project where everybody had a bay leaf. Everybody had a bay leaf. And at one point, this person wrote down in their journal, they were doing the study, they wrote down that this bay leaf reminds me of, it had held these sort of mottled colors in it. She said, it reminds me of a stained glass window. At one point this came up in the discussion, and you looked around the group, and all of a sudden everybody took up their leaf, held it up to the sun, and did this. They hadn't done that before she wrote that. And then you could hear this gasp go through the group. So everybody looked at that thing coming through the light. I mean, wow. I mean, that's, so the it reminds me of can take you poetic, or sometimes if this reminds you of something, there may be a similar mechanism behind this thing and what it reminds you of. So you're giving yourself a better tool for starting to figure things out, scientifically or poetically. Right? So here's your, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of. Right? The page can also be used as a platform for starting to figure stuff out. So let me show you kind of what that looks like. Here's a page. My initial approach is on the page, I just get down, I notice, I wonder, it reminds me of, and I put it down on the page. So usually I start with my observations using writing and drawing and quantification. So here is drawing, here's writing, here's writing. Here's quantification. It's a windy day, and this bird is leaning into wind coming from this direction that is gusting between 5 and 6 on the Beaufort scale. I'm one of those nerds who carries a little Beaufort scale in the back of my book. Right? And if you want one, you can download one from my website. Go to the store, it's a free download. You can get your own Beaufort wind scale. All right? And so this was the posture when the wind would blow, and this was the posture when the wind would slack. So it was going whoosh, 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 whoosh. And my car was 10 feet away from this bird on the post, and it was right? And it didn't fly away, so I had a question. It perched within 10 feet of my car. Why didn't this bird fly away? I'm writing my question. Over here is it reminds me of, IRMO. I like the little equal sign. Sometimes I'll put in equals for it reminds me of. It reminded me of playing in the surf. When the wave comes, you kind of lean into it. Or those Krummholz trees at high elevation. This was like the Krummholz bird. And then here I was sort of describing its posture as it's tearing this little thing apart. As I was sketching, I was bouncing between these different drawings. Finally, when it flew away, I had a little bit of time and added a little bit of watercolor up into that one. But this is, notice this is just, I wonder, this is how In Wormo looks on paper. Right? Now what happens is I can start to go meta. So I can look at this and float up from, let's notice what I'm noticing. Right? And over here, I started looking at this, and I said it lifts its head and straightens its back and legs. And then I realized, no, its back is kind of arched, but it keeps its head down. And it's actually lifting with its legs like a weightlifter. And so I disagreed with myself. I said, no, most of the pull seems to be in the back, not the legs, not the neck. So with the legs, not the neck. And what's the last time that you actually disagreed with yourself and noticed it? Right? But when you see your stuff on paper, you can kind of you have the opportunity to do that. You expect yourself to make mistakes in observation and look for opportunities to correct them. And I like doing it directly on that page instead of oh God, I've erased that. It's like this is this raw thinking process. And let's kind of look at also what you can do on this meta level a little bit more. Here with this question, I can actually, when I start to think about that, I go okay, that's a question I asked. Let's go meta on this. So let's think about that. All right, here's what you do with a why question, by the way. When you have a why question, you can't directly observe its answer. The first step of why questions is to start to come up with different possible answers. There will be several possible answers, right? And so I start to think to myself, here we go. Maybe this bird is just sensory overload from the wind, and it's just, this is so much going on that it can't even deal with this guy in the car right next to it. Right? Or maybe it's hard to fly in the wind. Or maybe they don't like to fly when they have a prey item in their talons. Right? And so as I'm watching, I put these down on my journal. This is my thinking process. So this is also a place for my thinking about what I'm thinking about. That little question mark right up here, that is the stand-in for all the other possibilities that I haven't thought of yet. Right? So then while I'm watching, this bird all of a sudden takes off, spreads its wings, and flies off through the gusty air with no problem. Flies right over to another fence post, circles around, and lands, no problem. And I thought to myself, that's really weird. It did not appear to me, of course I'm not inside this bird's brain, didn't appear to me that it had any problem with that flight. It didn't seem labored at all. Just in this, my car is rocking in the wind and the bird's just going do. And so I thought to myself, I wonder if it's, this makes it me, I'm thinking this explanation then is less likely. Right? So this is your brain on paper. One last thing I put in sort of on a meta level, here's my title. Alright. Anybody know the poem? Alright. So, this is that, I noticed, I wonder, it reminds me of problem-solving, meta-analysis, all that stuff together on the page. There's no order that you're supposed to go in. I usually just recommend people start with whatever mode is comfortable. Just start with observations. Just kind of begin to get them down, because they're the raw materials for all this stuff. If you like drawing better, lead with drawing. If you like writing better, lead with writing. All right? And then as questions pop up, as it reminds me of pop up, you're going to just catch those, get them down on paper. It's a fluid, moving thing. Then every once in a while, intentionally kind of pop up float above your journal and think down on your thinking and your experience. And then get back in there in the weeds of the observations and then pop out and think about what you're thinking. Right? Be asking questions. Be exploring ideas. All that can happen. And that's so much more richer a process than this idea of my journal is a place to make a portrait of this pretty flower. Right? Think of your journal not as a portfolio piece of nature illustrations that you've made, but your best tool for engaging with the world. Right? So there's your toolkit, your in a wormo problem solving, and all this stuff, it's going to radically change who you are and the way you interact with the world. I don't know of any better tool for focusing attention. It'll pull you into seeing a level of subtlety and nuance and difference in the world, in things that otherwise are completely invisible to you. I've discovered that if I start journaling with the same approach about a wonderful moment I'm having with my children, all of a sudden my memory of that and my experience of that is also enriched. So you can apply this in all sorts of places in your life. And it turns out, people who study this stuff have figured out that the part of your brain that's involved with attention is actually the same part of your brain that does memory. So if you want to remember things better, pay better attention. So this process is this incredible attention memory feedback system. And so if you're ever on a trip somewhere, you stopped and maybe made a little sketch of that abbey on the hill, that moment is crystal in your head. But what happened the rest of the trip? When you weren't sketching, we forget it. We forget it. And also, our memories will drift over time and change details of what we've seen. And we're not aware of that because our brain then invents new details and sticks those into our memories, because when you remember something, you remember a full picture. But we cannot tell the made-up stuff or the confabulations from the actual stuff. This then provides an anchor so that our memories don't go too far out to sea. We've talked a little bit about the role of externalizing your thinking. And how when this gets onto the page, your brain gets bigger. You want an even bigger brain? Get a bigger notebook. Right? But the more you actively use it, the more resource, the more things your brain's going to be able to dance with. Right? Another thing that this process does is it trains us in visual thinking and communication. This is huge. This is huge. It's a big part of our basic education that's also missing, in addition to statistics. We have no real visual literacy. But it ends up being extremely powerful. Being able to map ideas out like this makes something easier for other people to understand and remember. In your thinking process itself, it's critical. It also can be a very powerful communication persuasion tool. Has anybody ever been, you're in a meeting with a group of people that are trying to figure something out, and there happens to be a visual thinker in the room who then reaches over and pulls over an envelope, and on the back of an envelope, just makes a little diagram and pushes this across the page, and you see, like, I see these things fitting together this way, and all of a sudden people go like, oh my gosh, it's a pyramid. And this becomes the organizing idea that drives the rest of the discussion. Does anybody, raise your paw if you've seen something along that line happen, right? So it turns out that the person who controls the envelope controls the meeting. The person who controls the envelope controls the meeting. Because that person could have made that drawing any number of ways. And if an image occurs to you, and you share that with the group, you can actually take people in that direction. So if you've seen people who also do visual facilitation of a meeting, and as the meeting's going on, they're drawing pictures and kind of getting salient points, those people have to have a very high ethical standard and no initial intent of driving the meeting in any direction, because what they choose to put down can radically change the course of the discussion and people's memory of what was discussed. It's that powerful. So they have to be really careful that they're not bringing their own agenda to the table. Right? It's that powerful a tool. It will change the way that people remember that meeting. So if you're able to do that on the fly, on the go, in the middle of the discussion, you have this incredibly powerful tool. And also think about in science. We've had art over there, science over here for such a long time. We've got all these working bench scientists who have no visual literacy. And they're having to go out and hire scientific visualization experts to help them visualize their data and be able to present that in a way that you can be communicated to other people. Right? What if we brought that back into science, not just for communication, but also the essentials of thinking? Right? Watson and Crick did not have any clue about the double helix nature of DNA until they looked at Rosalind Franklin's photograph. And you could clearly see the double helix in it. Like, there's the picture of the double helix. And they went, do you know what? It's a double helix. Right? Yeah, she kind of knew that. And got snubbed for the Nobel. Right? That's another story. So, part of this also is that just because you're doing this visual stuff on a regular basis, your drawing skills get better. But if you put this first and make this your goal, you lose a lot of the advantages of all this other sort of stuff because your journal very quickly turns into a precious place for making a pretty portfolio to show other people. But instead, if you realize that this is going to come along automatically if I make a lot of pictures, you will make a lot of pictures, you're going to get better and better and better and better at drawing. Your visual literacy skills are going to continue to grow. That stuff is going to take care of its stuff. This is a sidecar that comes along automatically. The last big piece that I want to suggest to you is that doing this is what science actually looks like. This is actual science. So this kind of observation and curiosity and investigation and engagement of the world, that's what science looks like. The National Academy of Sciences and other scientific institutions and educators got together and they realized that for years we've been teaching science as this big pile of facts in a book. But it's not practiced that way. We get people to college level and they don't understand fundamentally how to do science because they think that they're supposed to do is get really good at memorizing stuff. But that doesn't work. That makes good test takers. It doesn't make scientists and engineers. So they spent more than a decade working on what would a real science education look like. And they developed a series of science standards that if this were taught in schools, we think this would turn people into scientists and give them the scientific thinking schools. It's called the Next Generation Science Standards. Right? It's been adopted by the state of California and a number of other states, and it is absolute gold. There's such rich thinking in this. I absolutely love it. As a curriculum developer, as an educator, and I've taken elements from what they pulled together in this and just put that into my regular routines of being a human being and a naturalist and investigating the world. I so wish that I was trained in NGSS, with this NGSS approach, when I was a little kid. Right? I got science the old way, the big pile of facts. Essentially what it is here's the quick overview of this. Now if you're, say, a homeschool teacher and thinking like, this isn't really relevant to me because I'm not beholden to some state or national standards on science. But there's such good stuff in here, I'd say mine this for what is really useful to you. Like Bruce Lee says, like, absorb what is useful. Right? And you're going to see that in this, there's some real great stuff to adopt. Essentially, there are three parts of this scientific endeavor. There's what scientists know. That's the stuff that's in the books. That's the stuff that we're used to thinking of as the science things that we memorize. There's what scientists do, the activities of science. And then there's how do scientists think? Right? How do they put ideas together? What are the sort of big concepts that help them find connections between things? So there are these three big parts, equal importance to all of them. And what I want to do is to unpack this what scientists do a little bit more. This part here, they call their disciplinary core ideas. This part here, their science and engineering practices. This is what they call their cross-cutting concepts. Let's take a look at what the National Academy of Sciences said, this is what scientists do, these science and engineering practices. And if you look down the list here, this is a lot of stuff that we're doing here in our journaling. All right, so we're asking questions. It's interesting that one thing that isn't on here is making observations. It turned out, so people have asked them about that, they just sort of assumed that that's such a basic thing that of course you're doing that at all levels. But I actually think that making observations is something that we need to really train ourselves to do. So I wish they had put that in there instead of just said, well, of course everybody's going to know that we're going to be making observations. My one little beef with NGSS. But there's really useful stuff in here. So using mathematics and computational thinking is in there. Constructing explanations from evidence. This is a big deal. So you think like, oh, I know what's going on with that. Then you think they're training kids to automatically go, okay, that's interesting. What's the evidence for that? How strong is the evidence for that? Right? Is there any evidence that doesn't support that? Right? That's how we actually move things forward. We're going to make arguments based on data, based on evidence. And when we don't have data for something, right, we can say, well, here's a possibility, but we want to keep that role of evidence at the top of the list in how we are constructing explanations for things. Another piece that I love in this is that they're also they're getting information. They look at how do you get information and how do you evaluate information. Right now, it's really easy to get information on stuff. But you can go to 20 different websites and find 20 different alternate facts for things. How do we honestly go about evaluating the quality of claims of evidence? And if a source on a regular basis gives me misinformation, I'm going to stop using it as a source of getting information from. Right? So the evidence behind what we see is critical in this way of approaching things. You'll notice that something that isn't in here, there's no reference to the scientific method. These are the methods of science, but they're not saying use the scientific method. And this surprises some people because they say, wait, but the scientific method, that's this thing that has been around for forever, and we've got all these wonderful things we've developed using the scientific method. So here's the history of the scientific method. How long has it been around? The scientific method, right? The scientific method. I'm not talking about the methods of science, but the, capital V, scientific method. That thing which we learned in school called the scientific method has been with us since 1945. In 1945, this guy wrote this paper and called The Elements of Scientific Method. And in that, he went around to a bunch of scientist friends and said, what are the things that you do in the course of your day doing your science? And said, well, here are my science things. He said, oh, thank you for that list. Essentially trying to come up with a list of what are science and engineering practices. And then went to another group of scientists and said, some scientists said these were science things. Do you agree with this list? And they looked at it. He said, yeah. And then he took a subset of that list and put them in a little sequence and said, this one makes a little story when you do it like this. We should call this the scientific method and teach this in schools. Textbook manufacturers picked up on this, and they've been doing that ever since. So we've been shoehorning our thinking into these are science practices, right? But this very reductionist way and often just sort of agonizingly irritating approach, very often irrelevant. We've been forcing ourselves to do this. So like let's take like the classic science fair experiment where like I'm going to play rock music and classical music to my begonias here and see how they respond, right? And there's usually such a small sample size and they're bad gardeners that one of them will inevitably die, and then like see that killed, like Mozart murdered my mums, and begonias love their Black Sabbath. And so besides sort of, some problems in thinking there, but though often part of this process is they had to come up with their hypothesis. I hypothesize that the ones that hear Mozart will thrive, and the ones that hear Black Sabbath, those plants will wilt. Why would you do that? Is there any basis for that guess? And aren't you actually biasing your observations by a priori saying, I expect these ones to live and these ones to die, now I'm going to go do my experiment and see what happens? If I'm saying, I expect this to happen, I've just introduced bias. There's these double-blind experiments that people do when they're doing drug trials are all about kind of getting any expectation of what I should expect to see out of the observer. So why are you doing this? It turns out it's not necessary at all to do there. All you have to do is I'm going to make different kinds of sound to these different plants, and I'm going to see what happens. That's authentically what the person is doing, right? And if they have enough replicates of that, they'll realize that, hey, there is really no difference. Okay, but the problem is that because they're trying to shoehorn in a hypothesis, they think that this is part of the process. You have to do this. You don't have to do it. Right? It turns out, where is making a hypothesis useful? We actually saw it earlier. Remember when I had that why question? So hypotheses are something that you use specifically for why questions. If you can't directly observe the answer, if you can only infer it, you come up with several possible explanations, and you look at how strong the evidence is for those different sorts of things, and see if you can sort of weed out some of the ones that are less likely. That's where a hypothesis actually comes in. It's a little corner of the scientific endeavor. The scientific method, right? So the scientific method is now sort of dying is withering on the vine, and people are engaged now in this process. All those scientific method things, people are still do data analysis. That is the science and engineering practice. But you don't have to kind of shoehorn things into this process. So think about your own nature journaling practice. How does this process relate to that? And what can you do to make it, what you do, even richer and bigger? I'm not saying that the way you are nature journaling is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. Whatever you do, if it brings you closer into a deeper communion and connection with the world, this is good. If you enjoy it, this is good. If it gives you happiness, this is good. I am, though, suggesting that here are some possible ways to expand what we're doing to make another even really incredible, useful tool. Right? Now what we want to do is to try to teach that to other people. So, excuse me. How do you take this and teach it to somebody else? For years, I have been experimenting with exactly that question. How do you get this into the hands of kids? How do you help adults be able to use this? And that's why I started the Nature Journal Club. That's what most of my environmental education work has been. I spent many years as an outdoor residential environmental education teacher, and in that I experimented with a whole bunch of different ways of doing nature journaling with kids, and I found a lot of things that didn't work. And I found some things that did, and I want to share those with you. All right? I'm going to give you an overall structure of how I think about setting up successful environmental education programs, and I'm going to show you some examples of what that can look like. So a few things you're going to need to start off. You're going to need some nature stuff, so some subject. That can be your bay leaves, those little stained glass windows. Right? That can be, so generally the more intrinsically interesting whatever you're looking at is, the more interested students are going to be in it. Right? If you put people in front of a subject that is really kind of low in stimulus, it's going to be less interesting. When you find something that you're really curious about, rather than, I gotta get something for my students to journal about. Okay, I'm gonna get these, right? Like, if you personally aren't fascinated by pine cones, then don't bring pine cones into the classroom to study. Right? If you're fascinated by pine cones, go for it. right? So find interesting things, right? And part of what happens is the more you kind of get enriched with these processes, you can find fascination in anything, right? But often it sort of, at the start especially, the more interesting and curious the thing that you put in front of somebody, it's going to capture their curiosity too. So you look for things that make you go, oh, that's weird, I'm interested in that. If you're authentically interested in it, they're probably going to be the same way. And then we're going to take those subjects and we're going to combine them with an activity. An activity. We're going to take some, what I find, so here's an example of not an activity. Here's what I found didn't work. I would say, all right, everybody's got a journal? Yes, I've got a journal, I've got a journal. Okay, what I want you to do is we're now spread out on this hillside for the next half hour. I want everybody to find a plant and make a really careful drawing of it. Go. I found these activities did not work well, right? The more structure and scaffolding and support, so people knew exactly what they were going to be doing, that I can give, the more successful students would be, the more fun they would have it, and the more likely they would want to do it again. So what could an example of an activity look like? Here is an example of one. So not go draw your plant, see ya. Right? Here's an example of an activity. I want, when I say go, we're going to play a game with our journals. When I say go, we're going to spread out from the spot. I want each one of you to go out on this hillside. You're going to find one plant, and that's going to be your secret plant. In your journal, you're going to sit down carefully next to it, and I want you to record as much information about that subject in your journal as you can. I want you to use both writing and drawing. Raise your hand if you're more comfortable drawing. Okay, so you people who are drawers, your journal notes can be mostly drawing, but I want you also to start to incorporate some writing, some written notes, because some things are actually easier to show with a few words. Something's got a fuzzy leaf. You know, how do you draw a dark green leaf with white cottony fuzz all over it? That's hard to do. If you write a little note here, dark green leaf with white cottony fuzz on it, little line over to it, that's a lot easier. So you're going to use both writing and drawing. If you like writing, it can be mostly writing, but I also want you to start including some visual note-taking, because same way, some things are easier shown that way. But what you're going to want to do is to record in your journal enough information so that at the end of 12 and a half minutes, you're going to hear this duck call, right? And when you hear that, you're going to come back to this spot. I want each of you then to pick a partner, and you're going to bring your partner back out to the place where you were journaling. Right? You're going to say to your partner, here are my notes. You give them your journal, and you say, my plant is growing somewhere right in this area here, which, not just which species is it, but which individual one. You have to figure out, you win the game. You win the game if they say, this is your plant, I'm 100% sure, and they're right. So what are some examples of clues that you could put on the page of your journal that would help them pick out your plant? I'm going to ask you folks that. Tell me a few things. What are some kinds of clues that they could put down?
Size, what if I...
Great. So either the scale or writing in, this is how tall it is. If you didn't draw it life size, that can be really confusing. So scale, that's really helpful. And at this point, what I will often do is I will pull out of my notebook dry erase pen that works. A dry erase pen that works. Ladies and gentlemen, a dry erase pen that works. Give it a hand. I've got a little portable whiteboard, and I will, as students suggest things, I will pull this out and I'll say, like, so here's my little drawing. I already talked about doing this, and I'm going to add in some little written notes there. She just said some scale, so I'm going to write in, how big this is. What else could I do that would help the person pick out my color? Great. So here's some color notes about that. And often just writing, it's green or it's brown, not very helpful. Is it dark green? Is it dark yellow green? All right, let's modify, especially the terms green and brown. Some written notes in there about those colors. What else? What else would really help them? Sir?
How many are in one area?
Great. So how many are in one area? Is this the only one? And I might put that in with some writing there. Or I could even draw a little map sort of showing the distribution of these other ones. And mine is right there. There's a little log that's over here, and this is where the edge of the tree is. A little scale on that map. Great. What else?
What kind of soil it might be?
Oh, you think like an ecologist. So that you really kind of, with the kind of what's near it and the soil in around there, I love it, I love it. Give me one other idea.
Like specific characteristics on that one plant that you're looking at.
That's huge. So it's got a little, there's a spot on this leaf here, and I'm going to make the bug bite on this leaf here. The stem bends at this little kind of weird kink angle here. Those things that make this individual, I'm going to get those down into my notes. Just in a quick, sketchy thing like this, really helps people visualize what that can look like. All right. So, are there any questions? On your mark, get set, go. And then they're off, they do it, and then I usually don't even wear a watch, I just watch them. And if the students are really just like jamming and into it, oh wow, right? I just let it roll, let more time go along. And if it's cold or they're getting really fidgety, then that 12.5 minutes gets shorter. So the reason I say 12.5 minutes is because it sort of feels like something's gonna happen at that point, right? If I say 10 minutes or 15 minutes, it feels like much more kind of loose, but people say like, oh man, at that moment I better be ready to, okay? And then they come back, they go get their partner, they do it, and you tell them that if your partner has trouble, you can narrow down the area for them. Right? So if your partner has trouble picking it, you can narrow down that area for them, or you can move them around so they're looking at the subject from the same angle that you were. With those little kind of helpers in there, the students are going to be 100% successful doing this. And it's really fun. So what it is you've just tricked them into making this dynamic page with all these elements, because we have to do that to play the game. Nobody's worrying about making a pretty picture. It's not plant portrait time. Everybody's doing this activity. And if you do it with a different plant in a different place, they'll have a completely different looking page. But the kids are often really surprised. I really like the drawing that I did. Often, especially with this activity, kids will say, this is the best drawing I've ever done. And these are people I've been working with a long time. These are just like, I'm working with a class for a day. And kids will say like, Mr. Jack, this was the best drawing that I ever did. Because they're actually getting themselves to look carefully at something, and people surprise themselves. So that's what I mean by an activity. And so what you want to have is a bunch of possible subjects, and then a handful of kid-tested activities that really work. So this is a free downloadable curriculum of kid-tested activities that really work. And it's now in its second edition. You can download this. If you go to johnmuirlaws.com, you can get to the download place from this directly from my website. We're currently working on the third edition of it. Myself and Emily Lygren, who is a brilliant educator and nature journaler, she is helping me work on the third edition of this, and our thinking on what really makes this work since this one came out is so much more nuanced and so much richer that this thing, people love it. The third edition is going to rock your little potato patch. It's going to be really, really good. If you want to get the third edition a little bit more quickly, you should become one of our beta testers. At the end of this program, I'll put up a little email. You send an email to that address. Every month you'll get a little packet of activities to try. That's like the new generation of our thinking on this. You'll test those with your students. Give us feedback about what works and what doesn't work. Any little things to tweak. We'll put those in. Also, if you scan examples, make high resolution scans of student work, and send those back to us with a permission slip, we're going to use your students' art to illustrate the third edition with real student examples. So get their permission to do that, and you'll have your kids published. It's going to be really good. I'm very excited about this. And that's also going to be distributed for free and translated into different languages. We're going to make also a series of videos where you can see real teachers and homeschool parents teaching these things with their students out in the field, real time, and what it looks like to help people be able to do that. So this is just an example of some of the kind of things that happen in that. There's one activity in which we get people to do what's called a joint comparison, where you're comparing two things side by side. And it turns out when you're looking at two different leaves at the same time, all of a sudden, when you look just at a leaf, you go, it's green. The minute there are two, you go like, oh man, this one is a really dark green, this one's a yellow green over here. This one is lightly fuzzy, this one is really, really smooth. Because you're comparing two things at the same time, you actually see more characteristics of both. We'll teach people how to create timelines of things, either by following one plant over time with a little twist tie around it. Can't do that in an outdoor education school, but at the outdoor ed school, what you can do is you can go out in a meadow with a bunch of flowers at different stages and try to find one that's sort of full bloom, and how much earlier can you find that? How much later can you find that? It's really fun. And all of a sudden, kids are time traveling in their journals. We can make comic books of events that we see. We learn how to make cross sections to do ecosystem analysis, make overhead maps of what we see. We talked earlier about how to kind of do sort of diagrams, cross sections, plans and elevation views of things to help people kind of turn these around in their heads. To take some subject, and if you draw part of it life size, part of it zoomed away, and part of it magnified, what you will notice about that is so much richer than if you're just trying to, I'm going to make a little drawing of it. So these are examples of each one of these would be a different activity that you would do with your students in a different place. They're all going to come in that that curriculum. I demonstrated making the demo. This is something that Emily figured out. It's huge in helping people be able to visualize what this thing is going to look like. As I'm talking about it, if I just sort of do a little mock-up as I'm giving my instructions, that helps a lot. Right? Now I want to show you two little add-ons that I'm having a lot of fun with right now. The first is that something that I see happen with a lot of students is they'll get out there and they'll start, and then all of a sudden their brain goes, you know what? Bing! I'm done. I'm done. And what do you do when you're done? You stop when you're done. Right? There's interesting psychological research on the feeling of being done. And when you're done, your brain just shuts off from what you were doing. You actually forget all sorts of information that you were kind of having to deal with, and you just shut down. When this hits a student, it's really hard for them to kind of get back into things. And if you have this kid who feels that they're done and everybody else is still doing it, all of a sudden that's a distraction for the rest of the group. So the way to deal with done is to anticipate it. And what you tell them is that partway through any of these activities, at a certain point, you are going to get a feeling. And it's the feeling of, oh, I'm done. Right? And it's going to happen to everybody. And it's going to happen at a different point for everybody. But here's the thing, that feeling of being done, it's just a feeling. And it has nothing to do with this project or this process or the amount of observations that you could make from this thing. It just is something that your brain does to you. It's a point where your brain usually stops paying attention. So what I want you to do as you're doing this activity is just sort of notice that I'm done feeling. And wait for it, wait for it, wait for it, and then it will show up. And when it does, Just go like, oh, that's interesting. There's that feeling of I'm done. And just nod to it and say, hello, done. And then just keep going. And see what's on the other side of it. On the other side of the point where you usually stop paying attention is the undiscovered country. And see what are the coolest, that's often where the most interesting questions, the really precise, more detailed observations come in. They're all hiding on the other side of done. So let yourself, don't let that stop you, but just sort of notice when it comes and you keep going. I find now that when I point out that I'm done feeling to people, the kids actually have a lot of fun with it, right? And they'll say like, look, Mr. Jack, this is what I found when I thought it was done, and then I discovered that underneath this leaf there was a crab spider. Right? That's where the really interesting things come out. On the other side of done. The other thing that I'm starting to have some fun with is, I talked a little bit earlier about going meta. When the kids are just down in their project, it's hard to get meta. But if at the end of doing an exercise like this, the group backs off, you have a group discussion, you have a wrap-up, I will often then find that there is, I said, does anybody now have any other ideas of other questions or things that you could have put on your journal? Or say when you were doing this activity, your partner was finding your plant, are you wishing that you put something else in your notes, right, that would have really helped them? I say, well, now's your chance to do that. We're just going to take 5 more minutes, and I want everybody to go back into their notes, think about what you're doing, put a box around the most important thoughts, perhaps make a title if you've got some big idea that you discovered, any other little thoughts or notes about it, or if there are other details that you think would be relevant or helpful at this time. You do that. I let kids do that, and all of a sudden they're flying their little rocket ship above their journal, and they're looking back down and they're thinking about the way that they're thinking. So we're training people to do some meta things. So I'm now also looking at, you do an activity, you do your wrap-up, and then I just have a little bit of time to go back into that page, one more moment. The things that students do in that moment are often very interesting and are at that meta level. For the discussions that we do, the way I like to think about those is you can do a discussion just on what are the observations that you're making, what are the most interesting questions. What questions came up to you, and then you have a discussion about those questions. The kids are generating questions, they write those down in their journal. You have a discussion about questions that people are having. Or you get everybody's journals out there and you kind of can look at, oh, here's an interesting way of taking notes. Oh, that's a really good idea. And you can look at those sorts of things. Another way of doing that, though, is you can, with any of these activities, you can superimpose over that a larger concept that you're exploring. And so for instance, at the start of a journaling exercise, if I wrote at the top of the page the words function, how does it work? And then we went on and did the same project, having that at the top of the page would just, kids would be asking questions that would be relating to that, just by having that at the top of the page. And if you put in a different prompt, connection, how is it related or connected to other things on the top of the page, the sorts of questions that they would ask would often be, it just sort of tweaks people a little bit to think about something differently. So I have a list of different lenses that you could put in. Think of these sort of like different lenses that the optometrist can put over your eyes. You put in the function lens. You're actually seeing things differently because you're looking through that lens. You put in the connection lens. You're going to think about things a little bit differently because you've got that lens in, right? And so to help us with that, that's where this How Scientists Think part of the Next Generation Science Standards comes in. These are called the cross-cutting concepts. The National Academy of Sciences actually came up with this list for us, right? Here's what they think are some of the big concepts in science, the big picture ideas in science. And so I will often, you just pick one of these things. So some of these are a little bit, you want to read into the cross-cutting concepts. For instance, the connections thing is kind of hidden inside this one, right? Or here's function. So this is this list of big picture ideas that the National Academy of Sciences suggests that we kind of help students make connections with. I do find this list to be a little bit clunky when I'm first starting to use it. I'm now really used to it, and I really love my cross-cutting concepts. But when I first was looking at this, I found it a little bit difficult to initially connect with and engage with. So I came up with, instead, this list that does very much the same thing, but some people find it a little bit more initially accessible as sort of curiosity prompts, right, or inquiry lenses. So if you're thinking, what is it like, the sorts of things you're going to be noticing are going to be really different than if you're thinking, how does it work? Right? And so I will use one of these. I'll pick a random one and use that, or one that seems to be relevant to what we're seeing there, or ties into a larger theme that I'm doing with my outdoor ed group, or that I may be working with my homeschool family group. I'll pick, is there some kind of larger concept that sort of applies here? This list is a hybrid between the cross-cutting concepts. So here are all the ones that are cross-cutting concepts. Right? The cross-cutting concept list and the list that I found on the wall of an international school. Right? So this is, there's also a list that is on the wall of every classroom in the international school that is right next to my house. And I was going through these classes and realized this is a brilliant series of connections. There's an interesting one, the three at the end that aren't in the cross-cutting concepts. These end up being really important things to think about. And I just want to kind of put a little bit of a highlighter on those. They seem particularly relevant. So one is, they're intentionally asking, what are the different points of view on this? And just respecting the idea that intelligent people are going to disagree about things. What are the points of view about this? Think of how much is kind of going on in our culture right now where I'm right, no, I'm right, you're an idiot, no, you're an idiot. Right? Instead of, we disagree about things, and that's sort of, we should expect to see that. Right? I think a lot of the vitriol right now is because people are not able to effectively and respectively play with a different perspective than they have. It's a threat. It's not a threat, it's actually an invitation to see something slightly differently. This next one is really interesting. These kids are asking themselves, what is my evidence for that? So if they make a statement, what is my evidence for that? How do I know? What is my evidence for that? And that is really, really important. To have in science, where it's this activity of making explanations based on evidence. And you want to have one foot firmly planted in that. And just because somebody said it doesn't mean that it's so. Let's take ourselves as naturalists as an example. There's tons of naturalist folklore that just gets passed around. And somebody made it up at some point. Right? So it's all the stuff about, oh, did you know that the bite of the baby rattlesnake, or that the daddy longlegs has the most dangerous venom, but its bite is so small that it can't get through your skin. You know, this is stuff, people just made this up, right? But we hear it and you go like, wow. And what's interesting with naturalist folklore is that the more wild and crazy it is, two things. One, the more likely it is not to be true. And secondly, the more likely you are to remember it and want to pass it on. So when you hear something, you go like, wow, that's amazing. Instead of going, I'm going to remember that and tell everybody, you go, wow, that's amazing. What's the evidence for that? Right? And it keeps us back in this place that I really like called reality. And then the last one is, what is my responsibility to that? And to think of, like, do I have a role in this? Do I have a responsibility to that? Those kids in that international school, all of them were asking themselves these questions. I think that those kids are setting themselves up to be really effective citizens. I think that's really interesting. So those are my inquiry lenses. The last piece of this is giving students feedback. Right? So, here's what's going to happen. We set this whole activity up. We're telling the students it's not about pretty pictures, it's about your ideas and your thinking. And then what happens is they go out, they do that activity, and maybe they're not comfortable drawing, but they went out on a limb because this sounded like an interesting activity. You said it's not about the pretty pictures, we're interested in your thinking, your observations, your questions, and that sort of stuff. And so they get out there, they do that activity, and then they come back and they say, look at what I did. And what is the thing that we grown-ups, what's the first thing out of our mouth when somebody says, look at the drawing I did? What do we say?
It's great.
That's great, that's so beautiful. Oh, that's so good, what a great drawing. Oh, honey, I'm so proud of you, what a beautiful drawing. Right, so let's just review this. It's not about the pretty pictures, it's about our ideas. Good job, what a beautiful drawing. It's not about the drawing, what a beautiful drawing. All right, so you set them up. And then when you go around and you give the feedback for good job, attaboy, pretty drawing, right? Now the kid who shows you their drawing, that's the one who always gets positive feedback for their drawing. The one who didn't bring their paper up to you first, that's the person who feels a little bit more uncomfortable with their drawing. And they're over there going like, oh really? It was about the pretty pictures all along? Hey, thanks. Well, you got me this time, but see if you get me again. And you've just shut this whole process down by this pretty picture positive feedback. So I think feedback is important, and you can be positive feedback. You also can be completely authentic and give your feedback in a way that will get them to do more and more and more and more. So if we're saying it's about the observations, what might we give feedback on?
You could ask them a question about their observation.
Exactly. You see something that you're curious about. If you have a question about their observation, you can engage them in a discussion of the observations. Or just point out what one of their observations is. Oh, I noticed that you saw this. That's a really interesting observation. Oh, wow. That you've observed that this one has fuzz all over the leaf, and there's not as much of it on the top side. I wonder why that is. Why more fuzz on that underside? What an interesting observation. Or you could just find one of their questions and kind of bounce that back and just engage them with a question that they have. So you're going with what they've been authentically doing. And just bounce it. You're just a mirror. I'm noticing that you noticed this. Good noticing. Right? And that's all you do. And it is completely authentic, and it's really fun to do. So there's 3 things that I actually will do. One is those direct observations. I will also notice where they're using a tool in their toolbox that I want other students to use. Right? For instance, if they did a magnification of part of something and they use that in an interesting way, I'll say, look how Angelo has done this enlargement of this part. That's a really great strategy. Right? Remember, we did that exercise with that plant last week, and he's brought that in a different way in this. That's really effective use of that tool. Or that Samantha has put in scale over here to show you how big this is. And look, even on this one where she's got the picture of the tree, she's got a picture of herself next to it so you can see how big she is. That's a really great use of sort of showing scale. And then all the rest of the students will be looking at them going, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. I want to do that. Right? And they'll start to incorporate those. So either you see them using a tool you want more people to use, you just point that out, you shine a little flashlight on there, whatever they did, and then everybody's going to start wanting to do that same thing. Or, and notice that that's not saying, look at this pretty picture. You're saying, here's an effective science communication, visual communication tool. You're using this effectively. Let's everybody else steal this idea. Right? Or, what is one of their observations? And then, when they get a portfolio of work, after you've been journaling for a while, you've got a bunch of these things, what you do is you sit down with them, and it's really fun. You go to the front of the journal, and you look at the way they were observing then, and then you go 20 pages later, and you look at how are you thinking and observing now. And they will be able to see how they're getting more tools in their toolkit. The questions are getting more sophisticated, more nuanced, and the whole process is richer and better. And they'll be able to see their own progress and results because it's all there in that one journal. That's the nice thing about having an actual journal rather than separate sheets. It's all in that one book. You go to the front, you go to the back, it looks like it was done by completely different people because your brain has just gone, you got all these tools that are in that kit. Educational researchers have found that if students are able to believe and see that they, through their work, they're achieving things and they're getting somewhere, they're strongly motivated to do more and even to dive in and do the difficult things. This is what's called the growth mindset. Check out the TED Talk on growth mindset. That's your homework. Check out the TED Talk on growth mindset. And so if you just say to somebody, oh my gosh, you're such a good artist. That means you have a fixed trait called good artist. That's different from saying, man, you've really been working at this and look at how you're developing it. The more you're working at this, look, you can just see it. Look from this page to this page to this page. You're growing, your brain is getting bigger. You're physically rewiring your brain to be able to do this new skill. So it turns out that if you encourage kids to do math by saying you're good at math, those kids who are encouraged that way, they don't want to try the difficult problems because it's a threat to their good at mathness. But the kids who are encouraged by noticing their struggles and how they push through those and the strategies that they used, they hit those same difficult problems and they blast on through. All right, so this is a perfect way of teaching growth mindset. If you want to get a hold of these materials, here's the URL for the current second edition of the curriculum. Here is the email, so nature.journal.educators@gmail.com. You send an email to this, you'll get in the pipeline for the beta materials of the third edition. It's really good stuff, right? And then you can get, we'll help you, you help us, all right? Think about this big picture. Are there ideas that you see here that can improve your own nature journaling? Think about your own personal motivation for why you like to do it and how it helps you. It's exactly the same with our kids. This authentically works. Kids, once they get into this, they want to do more, and they want to do more, and they want to do more. Because this is honestly, legitimately, authentically good brain food. And they will see it. The same reason that we want to be nature journalers, and the same reason that we do this, people, they respond to it in exactly the same way. So why not put these really good tools that work in the hands of as many students as possible? I really deeply respect and appreciate that we've got this group of educators here in the room to be able to take this and share this with their families, with their students. And think about, whether that's with a grandchild or if you're in an academic or institutional setting, how these tools can be used by the people that you're working with. Thank you very much. Happy journaling, and share the best ideas that you get with somebody else. Thank you very much.